Hello and welcome to the Nested Healing Podcast. I am your host, Jess. Today we're covering the topic of cognitive stream, the head center, and how trauma may be impacted by it. Today I have three wonderful guests. Let's start with Anna Maria. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Thank you, Jess. I am a coach. I support people in their journey of empowerment and self-development to live an authentic life of purpose in alignment with their gifts, their passions, and their deeper calling. And I am a member of New Ventures West faculty and a founder of a school called Revision Academy and the author of the book Life Revision and Revision Tarot, which is soon to be translated to English. I'm from Colombia, based in an eco village, a couple of hours away from Bogota, the capital.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being here and thank you so much for your time. Next we have Emma. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah. Hi, I'm Emma Grant Dreyer. I'm currently a student with Jen at Western Institute for Social Research. We're studying to become therapists, and I'm hoping to work with trauma and primarily with people on the spectrum, hopefully, once I do get my degree. I'm also an artist and musician, and I love hanging out with my dog.
Awesome, amazing. Thank you again for being here as well. And finally, we have Jen. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Jess. My name's Jen. I'm the founder of Nested Integral Coaching Constellation. I'm also an integral coach, also a student on my path to becoming a therapist. And I think another way that I'll introduce myself in this particular episode is I'm also a person who's been impacted by trauma, who's had my own personal experience there.
Thank you for that, and thank you for the introduction. Getting into this episode, I wanted to open up a question to kind of just start and everything, since we're already talking about it. Like, what is cognitive? What does it mean to have like a cognitive view? What does it mean? Cognitive stream, a head center. What does that mean for our listeners? We'd like to open the floor to you guys to give your definitions and everything.
Well, I can start. The cognitive stream is basically what the center of intelligence that we have most developed, because the education system emphasizes the cognitive stream is how we think about something, is the understanding we have about any given topic, and how we structure our understanding of that topic.
Yeah, thanks, Anna. I think another thing I would add in like the sense of how I personally experience it, like when I'm in my own first person contact with these different centers, is cognitive would be everything I would describe as like my mental health, mental well-being, mental processes, and that may be intertwined with or separate from or distinct in some way from my emotional state or my physical somatic state. But yeah, I'd say everything that I experience is mental, I'd put in cognitive.
Yeah, I agree. I think that obviously they're impacted, but the cognitive for me means that I've separated something from all the other states that I have, and I'm just trying to look at it in a very kind of like medical, almost like clinical way of seeing how my experience is.
Understand. So it's more it's what we got going on up here, basically, like in our brains. It's like whatever it's us as almost a personality, not necessarily emotion, especially when we're talking about like we separate it. I know in NI2C through the repair program as like the head body, or the head, the mind, the heart, and the belly, or the body, right? That's kind of the separation as well. Yeah. Awesome. Um, so kind of leading off of that question, the one I kind of have is like, what is your understanding of how maybe different traumatic scenarios, big T's and little T's, impact the cognitive view, or how different processes work for different people? I feel like would be my next leading question.
I had something I guess I wanted to say about that in relation to like little t traumas. And I mentioned earlier, I wanted to, I was probably going to talk about autism as like related to trauma as well. I'm autistic, and I think a lot of little t traumas, even if you're an autistic person who doesn't feel like they've been impacted by a big trauma in their life, there are a lot of things just about the way that our world is structured, that are traumatic for a lot of neurodivergent people. So having to go through just, like going grocery shopping can be kind of traumatic because of how intense it is. And so all of those little things kind of will build up. And to protect yourself, or like to protect myself, I found a lot of ways to mask, and also a lot of ways to shut down my emotional process. So I was able to like only think or only experience life in a very like cognitive way, which has ended up being harmful. And I'm trying to deal with that now and kind of get back into my body and into my emotions. But yeah, I think a lot of those like little smaller traumas really pushed me into my like cognitive space, and I'm having to analyze things. And like something Jen also wanted to bring up, I think, was the maybe pattern recognition or hypervigilance. And that's something that became really helpful for me because I was able to look out for things that might re-traumatize me that other people wouldn't notice because they're small. But to me, I would be like, okay, yes, I know that those horrible overhead lights are going to really wreck me for the rest of the day. So I'm always going to be like on the lookout for that and trying to kind of like mitigate the harm from those things.
Yeah, thanks for sharing, Emma. Um, I think pattern recognition is a big piece for me too, that feels like it's in the cognitive realm of how I was impacted by trauma. Um, I think in my case, what I want to say is something around the fact of like a chronic long-term repeated exposure to trauma, the kind of trauma that's not just one single event, but the kind you live with through a whole stage of your life, whether it be in childhood or adulthood. I think that I developed a skill around sort of predicting the other person, the person who would be like, say, the source of danger at that time of my life, right? Predicting their patterns of their moods, of their behaviors, of their actions, of their thoughts, so that I could keep myself safe. So there's a lot of walking on eggshells, but being hypervigilant and looking for the subtle cues of what I needed to see to be able to predict and stay safe for, say, like the next episode or incident. And it really changed the focus of what was in my awareness all the time. It left little room, I think, for other things to be in my awareness when that was taking up such a big part of the bandwidth at the time. Yeah.
I don't know if you relate to this, but there's also the thing that they say happens often with children that are in traumatic situations where you'll intellectualize it even as a little baby, because you don't want to see like your caregivers or just general adults as being the danger, because then you're going to think that you'll die. Like it's not, your whole world would be unsafe, and that's not a manageable experience for a child. So then you like turn it back on yourself and decide that instead like you're the bad thing or you're the unsafe thing, and that everyone else around you is correct. And that's kind of the way that like a lot of children will be able to get through their childhoods, that dealing with abusive or just unsafe adults around them. And I think that's definitely like a cognitive process that starts quite early.
Yeah, along those lines, I'd like to say that trauma creates blind spots in the mind, big ones. There's a process which I will describe as a short circuit. So there's types of information or situations that the cognitive mind is unable or unwilling to process, And that creates a defensiveness. And there's no access to the cognitive function at that time, and it generates an emotional reaction, which might seem totally out of proportion with the situation. So that's a typical situation where oneself or somebody else has a reaction, and the other person says, "Where did that come from? Like, that doesn't seem rational. That doesn't seem reasonable," and both of those words, rational and reasonable, refer to the cognitive, like the ability to process something and think something through. Well, trauma inhibits that in specific situations that might trigger the trauma. And so the cognitive function is impaired at that moment. And I would add that those are bigger reactions, but then there's the smaller patterns that create personality. Given the type of little traumas that we suffer as children, we have blind spots about certain things, and then have an overemphasis on another set of information. So for example, somebody of a personality that is geared to please others will have an overemphasis towards people and their needs, versus somebody else who grew up and had other kinds of experiences, traumatic experiences, will have an overemphasis on safety and in the situation that's at hand with the dangers, as opposed to people. And that also has a cognitive is related to the cognitive, because our minds will pay attention to certain things and not pay attention to certain things, given our little t traumas and bigger traumas.
Yeah.
I think that was beautifully put. And I was like, in my opinion, and it kind of leads me to another question of like something that we kind of keep talking about, which is like pattern recognition. I feel like that's kind of the core of a lot of this, as like human beings, we're pattern seeking creatures. Like that's what is comfortable for us. And so it kind of leads to my another question is like, when we're in these patterns that are presented to us due to past incidents, big T's or little T's, as I've been calling them, and we've been using that term. I feel like the next question is like, how do we deal with them? For people who are very affected, like, how do they resource in a way breaking those patterns? I know it's very hard because we love, once again, we're pattern seeking individuals and we love patterns. What might we use as like tools?
I like reading my journals back. Yeah. And I find that that's been really helpful. Something that I do need to like, I guess I have been better with recently, but like I wish I had done in the past was not just writing in a journal when I'm feeling horrible, so that I'm not looking back and being like, wow, everything was chaotic. And like, and now I can read journals and see more of like patterns throughout like the month, for example, or like depending on where I was living or where I was working. So that's been helpful for me to reflect on myself, and also having people around me that I trust will bring things up if they're noticing a behavior of mine that I'm maybe not like aware of, or I don't think is negatively impacting myself or someone else. But I'm really grateful that I have people around me that have been able to like point things out, and that I feel comfortable like receiving that information from.
Another thing that helps me, it's along the similar lines of journaling, but I think another thing that helps me with recognizing and also shifting patterns is self-reflection questions, which is something that we use as part of the intro coaching methodology. Specific questions that are designed to maybe even help us access our blind spots, or help us notice what if we answer the same question every single day for 2 weeks, what stays consistent? What shifts day by day, right? Being able to invite my awareness to sort of focus and land somewhere that habitually I wasn't spending my energy on, and notice what grows as I bring attention to it. And so I think a custom tailored sort of reflection question, which is part of what we bring in a coach client dynamic, helps us to access parts of ourselves, or be aware of parts of our environment that previously might not have been accessible in our current pattern.
Mm-hmm. I'll start by saying that I read an exercise in a book called, the book is called The Life We Are Given. It's on the bookshelf of our professional coaching course at New Ventures West. That book, great book. And there's an exercise there called Take the Hit as Gift. And in that exercise, you, if I'm doing the exercise, I will stand and facing a certain direction with my hands out, facing out, and then the coach will be in my back, and the coach will at some point grab me in a way that is startling. And the exercise is for me to start noticing all the reactions that I'm having at that moment, and to name them, to give words to it. And that way I start to have a better ability to observe my reactions. And so that's a way to start interrupting the pattern. It's to observe what's happening when I get a big reaction, right? And so the metaphor of somebody grabbing us in a startling way is exactly what happens when we're triggered, and in that triggering has a trauma component. It's left over from the past. And so any person who suffered any kind of trauma will have these triggering events. So instead of not noticing and acting in an unconscious way, we can start realizing, oh, I just had a reaction, and start to be present when those reactions occur. And the other thing I'll say is self-regulation is one of the ways we can start to interrupt these patterns, particularly through breath work is something that really works for me and my clients. Breathing in a way that is conscious and slower. We can start to rewire the brain to regulate our nervous system as a whole, so that we won't be as we won't lose it in a way. And so that we can be more present and respond to life and to situations in a more regulated way. When we use the breath, our response will be with all the streams, also including the cognitive stream, and we will be able to think through the right way to respond in a given situation, as opposed to an unconscious and reactive way.
I love that you bring that up, Anna Maria. And I was just thinking as you were saying that, how we can isolate, like in a conversation like we're having right now about the cognitive impact of trauma. We can isolate what's happening cognitively for the sake of the conversation, but that in the actual healing and recovery process, we can't isolate it. We can't say, oh, this is a cognitive impact right now, so we can just stay in a cognitive solution, that including the body in that process, including our nervous system and our breath and movement, And integrating more than just our cognitive functioning into the healing process is so essential to be able to make those shifts. Yeah.
Yeah, that kind of leads me to another question. And I thought of like, I feel like when I personally am in that state and everything, there's always like sometimes intrusive thoughts. And I know Jenny wanted to touch on that too, where it's like intrusive thoughts kind of impact that as well. Um, like what what are your ideas on that?
Definitely found that to be a big part of my own trauma story. And I think before I found any sort of support or process for healing and recovery, one of the first things that I did pretty instinctively to try to cope with and deal with the intrusive thoughts was learn to self-medicate. So definitely I used substances to try to drown some of that out because it was far too much for me. Yeah, and there's a few different specific traumatic events in my life where that was overwhelming and self-medicating was my temporary solution. So intrusive thoughts can be debilitating in my experience.
I think I had an idea what intrusive thoughts were when I was younger, and it wasn't at all what my actual intrusive thoughts really were. And I think the same thing was happening with me, even though I thought I knew what intrusive thoughts were. And I was like, okay, well, when I have that like textbook definition, I know how to deal with it. Because from a pretty young age, I started trying to understand mental health because I knew that there was something up. And I didn't know like necessarily at that time that like my childhood had been a big uh, jumble of things that were going to affect me for a long time, but I did know that there was something happening with me internally that wasn't okay and that I wanted to fix. And so I was looking into a lot of mental health stuff, and just trying to educate myself more. And I kind of, again, like you said, like I was also using substances pretty quickly. I found that that would stop whatever was happening that I just thought was like an inherent wrongness with my brain, and not like other forms of intrusive thoughts or racing thoughts or like trying to over intellectualize things to the point of exhaustion, and it wasn't working. And so I was like, well, here's this really convenient thing that will just stop this all immediately, and then I don't have to, and then I can finally be in my body, because all of this stuff is happening in my head and it's too overwhelming. And some small part of me wants to get back into my emotions or get back into like my body physically, and it can't because I've like cut that off from for myself because it wasn't safe to be there. So yeah, I think that that was like substances were a really helpful thing in that way, where I was like, I didn't have any other tools to get myself out of just that process in my head.
Yeah. Mhm. So my understanding is that when the mind and the whole body actually is in fight or flight mode and it is dysregulated, that has a connection with intrusive thoughts, with negative thoughts. And so it's helpful cognitively to know that these thoughts will come up, and that there are different kinds of intrusive thoughts. I like to work with the saboteurs from the positive intelligence model. And there are 10 types of saboteurs. There's the stickler or perfectionist, there's the pleaser, there's the hyperachiever, the victim, the hypervigilant, the restless, controller, the avoider, and then the biggest one of all is the inner judge. And so I know this is a lot to hold if you've never heard of this before, but if you get to know these saboteurs and what they tend to say, you can label the thought like, oh, this comes from my perfectionist or stickler. Oh, this comes from my victim. And you depersonalize, you create some distance. You don't identify with the thought. You don't, yeah, you're not being influenced by the thought. It's there, and that's a part of you, but it's not you. And so when you learn to do that, these saboteurs start to lose their power. They might come here and again, but because your mind is already trained and aware of these mechanisms of these saboteurs, then next time you have an intrusive thought coming from either of these 10, then you're like, oh, that's not a helpful thought. That comes from my judge. I'm judging myself, or I'm judging another person. Or here I'm not respecting myself. I'm pleasing another in a way that's dishonoring my needs. Or any other way that the saboteurs get at you. And we have primary saboteurs. Like I have mostly the controlling, the judge, sometimes the hyperachiever. And when these thoughts come, these intrusive thoughts, it's very helpful when I create a boundary and I say, this is not a helpful thought at this moment. And I create an intention, a strong intention. Like, for example, this morning, I created an intention for myself. I said, I'm going to create a mood of confidence, because overwhelm has been in my field, in my psyche. It's very common these days to feel overwhelmed with so much. But when I create a strong intention, then I'll notice more often and more effectively when an intrusive thought comes that undermines my intention. And I'll be able to work through it with the power of my mind. That's the power of the cognitive stream. We can really notice, understand, and create a mental boundary around these intrusive thoughts.
Thanks for sharing that, Emma. Another thing I would say about intrusive thoughts that's been more on, I think my previous share was more about before I found any sort of healing path, but now that I've been on a path of healing and recovery for some amount of years, I don't have the same relationship with intrusive thoughts or experience of intrusive thoughts as I used to. And so in hindsight, I can kind of look back and see their function or purpose, even back in those years when I had no skill to be with them, as something that was more of like a cue. It was more of a pointing me towards where my work was. I didn't have any capacity to be with the work of healing at that time in the past. And for me, I don't think I had the capacity at all to be with or address those types of things alone. It really took the support of being with a coach and a group of supportive peers for me to be able to be with things that had been overwhelming. And so now I look back on it and I think of those intrusive thoughts as like an arrow pointing to like what part of my past experience, what part of my own unresolved trauma needs my attention? What feelings have I not allowed myself to feel yet? What sort of somatic, energetic process has not completed inside of my body yet? And being able to work through and process some of those feelings and sensations and allow myself to feel them in coaching sessions is how I was first able to start being with those. They were overwhelming and impossible to be with when I was sitting by myself in my room without any support. And yet, you know, in a container of support with a compassionate witness, I was able to allow myself to feel and digest and process some of that. And I realized that after any of those particular experiences had been processed fully by me in that way, like, you know, body, heart, and mind, with the support of a compassionate witness, that the intrusive thoughts weren't needed anymore. They didn't come up around those issues anymore. And so now when I have intrusive thoughts coming up around something, I'm able to trust that process, that sort of like processing, resolving, healing process, and take it as a cue that like maybe this is something I need to bring to one of my support people, maybe something I need some witnessing and processing around. And for me, the support of another person is huge in that.
Yeah, something I hear you guys like bring up kind of a lot, is like the dissociation and the distancing and like the aloneness that like really harbors kind of that mentality. I myself in my journey has also been in that place, and that was also my pattern too, was the alone, the not feeling supported and everything. I don't know if you guys kind of feel that too.
I think I had support. It just wasn't the support that I needed. So it sometimes ended up also being harmful because it wasn't like support that actually witnessed me and like accepted me where I was and like took note of my actual strengths and weaknesses. And um, yeah, I think that made things a little bit more difficult for sure.
I personally have a really big tendency towards withdrawal and isolation. That's like my sort of baked in pattern that I somehow wired in my personality, developed around when I was really, really small. And so it takes a lot of conscious effort and reminding and practicing a new pattern for me to reach out and ask for support or even to accept support when it's offered to me. So that's a new skill that I'm been building over the last several years. But I think my tendency towards I can just withdraw, disconnect, detach, and disappear. That was my dominant pattern for so much of my life that I really did try to cope with my trauma alone. And it was never really effective for me to do it that way. I'm so glad that I actually have support in my life now and that I have the ability to reach out and pick up the phone and ask for support when I need it, because I think it was both of those factors. It was I didn't have a support network before, and even if I'd had one, I wasn't willing to put my hand up and say, I need someone to talk to. I had to develop that skill too.
I had similar wiring as Jen of isolation and dealing with it on my own. I'm fine, I'm independent. That's how my personality got structured. And it took me quite a long time to learn to ask for support and invest in myself. And also, it took a long time to find the therapeutic modalities that worked for me. And when I did, it was a huge relief, and it really helped me leapfrog into a new stage of my development, of my life, because I was more in touch with myself, as many of you have been saying, of being able to process my emotions, my sensations. That definitely creates more quality of life because it reduces the intrusive thoughts. It creates more self-love, more self-compassion. And it's a journey to surround yourself with the right kind of support. It's the type of support that meets the challenges that you have in life. You know, there has to be a balance, the level of challenge and the level of support you have in life. And I think it takes people a long time to realize this. This is something I work a lot with my coaching clients is people come with a lot of challenge and they don't have enough support. And so it's how do you meet life with its challenges with the right level of support? And it's not just therapists and coaches, also a women's circle or a group that goes together to the movies or or that walks together in the mornings, or that dances together. And dancing is actually very important for trauma because dancing with other people creates safety and it goes into very old parts of the brain where, oh, I have a tribe, I'm safe, I'm not alone. Isolation creates more trauma. And so the more we can expand our levels of support to include all of these other kinds and in that way, nourishing a sense of safety, a sense of connectedness will be very, very helpful for recovery and healing.
And Maria, what you said about isolation can create more trauma, it reminds me a lot of Bessel van der Kolk's work, like the body keeps the score, of like how he just like sitting down with people and explaining and spending time with them. He spent a lot of time working with like veterans and creating groups for them, and how just doing that and creating levels of support for them with comrades basically who've gone through similar things, and how important, vital that is. And I think that speaks volumes for like humankind as well, that like even with like the dancing and how that like it makes us feel good because it makes us feel connected, and how like human connection is so vital for our survival. That rhymed. So yeah, I don't know. That's just kind of a statement that I'm just gonna like, if y'all have any ideas to shoot off of it.
I remembered something that helped me get out of that, like the notion that isolating myself or being like totally individualistic was like the best way to deal with things. And it was after doing enough research and also noticing enough in my own life on how that was true, that like connecting as a community was the most helpful thing for healing and safety. And then I could tell myself, like intellectually, I could say it's actually the most efficient way to be dealing with things is to be like opening yourself up to other people, even if that feels scary initially. Seeing it as like me making a more efficient move helped me feel less afraid, because people in general were always really scary to me. I didn't like socializing at all. I was really afraid of like crowds. I think my needs weren't met as a kid, and I also wasn't like respected really, like I think, which most children really aren't. I think at least in the States, like I don't notice people often seeing kids as full people that like deserve to have their needs met. So yeah, I think that was really helpful for me. It was like telling myself like, yeah, this is like on paper the best way to be, instead of just feeling like, yeah, I should be more connected with my community, or like that does feel nice. Like it didn't feel nice, it felt scary. So yeah, it was helpful.
Thanks for sharing, Emma. I've had the same experience. My first experiences at being in connection and support in healing places didn't feel good at first. It took a while before I actually felt the benefit of that support or felt able to connect to it. But scary would be probably my first first impression of that too. And I think for me that probably had a lot to do with how long-standing my pattern of isolation had been. And so anything that feels unfamiliar, I feel really uncomfortable. Yeah.
Yeah, I would say that when people are still very raw in their trauma, it really helps to be in circles with people that are facilitated by a trauma-informed facilitator.
Yeah.
Because that person will create a safe space using a set of tools that will create safety from the beginning. And this will include things like breath work or grounding or playing music or any kind of practice that will settle the nervous system and that will help people who have a overreactive nervous system feel more at ease and feel more welcome in the space, and to normalize that these reactions are human, and that we can feel nervous in the beginning of being in a group setting, but if the facilitator is trauma informed, we'll account for that and will bring in the necessary practices to settle and to help people feel more at ease. And slowly, that will contribute to the collective healing of everybody who's there.
Yes, that is such a good point. In repair, we put as much emphasis on the actual safety of building the container and the practices that we do together as we do on the curriculum. And I think for me, the first sort of peer, I would say almost support group, but the first sort of peer setting that I sought help from wasn't really trauma informed. It was really more about intellectual stimulation, it felt like, than about settling the nervous system together or belonging. That wasn't emphasized as much. And it didn't feel as safe to me at that time. So I could definitely feel the difference between, there could be so many skillful ways to facilitate groups, but if that skill isn't trauma informed and it isn't including the nervous system in the container of the group as priority, then it may be a struggle for someone who's just coming out of trauma. Yeah.
Oh, it makes me think of like how sometimes, like for me, I have a very hard time making friends. Like I think overall it's very difficult, and my question came from this thought I had, which was my partner, love him to death. He makes friends like there is no tomorrow. Like you set him off in a crowd of people he does not know, and he'll go make friends with everyone. And I'm very much the opposite, where it's like I wait for the person to pick me. So I think wish I could remember my question around it. But I think it's interesting, like the difference in personalities and how there's not really a cookie cutter method. Oh, here it is. It's how like seeing different parts and different strategies from different like therapies and everything work for different people. So it's not always going to be one thing. And kind of like what your guys' experience is with that, because I know for me, I can't talk therapy for me isn't the only thing that works. Like I needed more. I needed someone to like not necessarily hold my hand, but be there for me.
Yeah.
Kind of your guys' perspective, I guess, on that.
I wasn't able to like even consider not drinking anymore until I was introduced to a completely new environment and community of people, and I was able to see that it was actually possible for like humans to genuinely care about each other and like be there for each other and accept each other like where they were at, and not like want things from people, or want to change people, or like just exist entirely in a selfish way. And I think, yeah, I mean, I would hope that it would be possible. You know, there's lots of different paths that you can go down in life, and I'm just really glad that that one was where I ended up, because I don't think, yeah, I think that despite how many years I'd been in therapy, and despite having already gotten my undergrad in psychology, and like trying out all these different medications, and I was like doing all the self-care stuff, exercising all the time, like, you know, trying to be social, but I just that all didn't work until I was shown an entirely different like community of people that weren't going through the same processes as like the communities that I'd grown up in. And also, I guess along with that, I wouldn't have been able to deal with any of my trauma if I hadn't stopped drinking. So like I had to have that happen and see all of those people, and then finally after like a couple years, like be able to get myself to a place where I felt like I was safe enough to put away that like primary coping mechanism. I had all these coping mechanisms, but none of them worked except for alcohol. Nothing else was like in my opinion, settling my nervous system in the way that alcohol could. So I had to get to that point where I finally felt close enough to safe, definitely not safe yet, but like close enough to safe that I was like, okay, I'm going to be able to put this down for a bit and like let myself feel all of this like years and years of like terror that's like stored up in my body that I've been just trying to like process only in my head. Um, so yeah, all of those little steps like had to happen for me to think that it would be okay to finally actually deal with my trauma and not just kind of like surface level deal with it, I guess.
Something that's coming up for me now, I don't know if it's related to the topic or kind of a topic shift, but I think about another thing that's kind of was going on cognitively for me, sort of in the background over decades, like lifelong, but that was always kind of running in the background was a sort of desire to make some sort of meaning or some sort of sense out of things that had happened. And it wasn't something that I was always hyper actively involved in. It could be like dormant in the background and really outside of my awareness. And then like a little piece of information would come in. And the very first thing that would come up in my mind is like, oh, and this is how it helps me make sense of what happened to me. Like I can give an example. I remember going back to school, going back to college in my early 30s and being in a sociology class and talking about social problems and learning the statistic that in the United States, 1 out of every 3 women has experienced sexual assault. And the very first like thought that I had in response to learning that statistic wasn't about what that means sociologically. It was making sense of my own experience. My very first thought around that was, oh, I'm 1 of 3. And I took that a little further to find some like perspective or relief or a way to calm down everything that ignited in my body, just sort of hearing that statistic. And I took that further, and my next thought was, I'm also 1 out of 3 sisters. I grew up with 2 sisters. And then I had this sort of next response. It was all very related to integrating my trauma, which was like, statistically, if this happens to 1 in 3, maybe somehow, because it's happened to me, it won't happen to them, you know? And I know that's not the way statistics work mathematically and whatnot, but this was my brain trying to make sense of something that I'd experienced and trying to make some sort of meaning out of it. And this was about something that had happened 2 decades before, you know, a little more than 2 decades before. No, about 15 years before at that point. And so it's not like I was for 15 years searching for that statistic or that answer, trying to make sense of it actively, but this is dormant thing in my mind where it's like any little piece of information, like the first cognitive response is like, and how can I make some meaning out of this? That process, you know, sort of overarches many, many, many years of my life.
Yeah.
Kind
That
of
exact thing happened to me. Like when I found that statistic, I also grew up with 2 younger siblings, and I was like, oh, phew, okay, so like this means that they're fine. And then I also was like in the back of my head, I was like, no, that's not how that works. But I was like, no, it is. I'm gonna think that it does work that way because that's gonna make me feel better. And I think I did that, yeah, with a lot of things. I was definitely helpful to try to make meaning of something so that it wasn't just like too intense, all this information about yourself and the world happening all at once that you couldn't control. I think making meaning of something gives you control over things that you don't actually have control of.
Yeah. Well, speaking of these coping mechanisms, alcohol, drugs, I have a number of family members, one in particular who's dealing with addiction and in a very difficult situation right now. And cognitively, it really helps me to understand the source of addiction, according to one of my mentors, and it's to understand that addiction comes from a dysregulated nervous system who hasn't found a proper way or a healthy way to regulate. And as Jen was saying earlier, self-medicates. And that's the source of all addictions, according to my mentor. And this dysregulated nervous system is caused by trauma. And so to heal, we have to go back to that original source of that trauma and heal that in order to relearn and repattern the brain, so that the way to self-regulate will be different. And it sounds like both of you have learned, have experienced, first of all, unhealthy coping mechanisms, and you have recovered from that. And that journey is in itself, it fills me with hope that if you can do it, anybody can do it. And it's not easy, but it is possible. And I think the cognitive stream is important in as a starter to see that there is a path forward, and people have been in that path and have recovered. And that is a cognitive understanding, listening to these stories, understanding what is going on in the nervous system, how come I'm addicted to a substance, and how can I let go of that addiction to actually learn to regulate my nervous system in a different way, and take ownership of that of that situation, but in a way that heals me.
100% agree with that. That's exactly how it feels for me, that all those years of self-medicating was a substitute for self-regulation that I did not know how to access at that time.
Yeah.
And I guess I'd also add that what precedes the ability to self-regulate is co-regulation.
Yes.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
that being introduced is what helped me build that ability.
Definitely agree.
Can you say more about that, Jen?
If I think back even to, the way this works in childhood, like if there aren't traumas that interrupt anything, if everything goes perfectly as expected developmentally when you're young, babies are not able to self-regulate. We're not born with that skill. Like we learn it through co-regulation, through the regulation of our caregivers' nervous systems, helping us to regulate our nervous systems until we can eventually do it on our own. And as an adult, if we're still struggling with regulation, if we didn't get that co-regulation or ability to self-regulate coming up in childhood, it's not like we can just skip that step. We still need that, because our nervous systems, we're communicating with other people's nervous systems all the time. And the way that we learn regulation is through like feeling and experiencing that from others. So there were probably so many times early on in coaching as a client with my coach. Early on, there were so many times I showed up to coaching completely dysregulated, either really shut down in like a freeze state, or really activated up in like a fight or flight state. And I would show up that way, and I was welcomed exactly how I was. Every way of showing up is perfectly fine in coaching. There's no judgment around that. My coach always received whatever state I was in, but my coach would be able to introduce small invitations, little practices, such as like, can we take a few breaths together? Let's see if you can feel your feet on the floor. And my coach would be in these practices with me too. And this sort of invitation of co-regulation, of being in these regulating practices together, was really needed for many, many sessions before I think I started to do it on my own in between sessions and realized like, oh, wait a minute, I can also access this even when I'm not in coaching. And that's when the self-regulation was kicking in, but it was through being invited into shared practice.
Yeah.
In that co-regulation that I first learned that. And I'm sure there's probably other ways my coach was co-regulating with me, even without inviting me explicitly into a practice. Things like, if I can recall back, I may be speaking a mile a minute, I'm hardly breathing, I'm very activated, and then all of a sudden I pause and a big breath, and my coach would say something like, that's a good breath. There's like this little reinforcement of like, yes, connect with your breath, right? Without being invited into a formal practice. So this was a thread that was just integrated into the way that we related. And I think, yeah, there's a way of picking up on that and integrating that into things I could take outside of sessions.
Thank you. That's very helpful
Yeah.
to hear that. As a coach, to enrich my own practice of how I can be more trauma informed and I can support in that co-regulation. I've always known that in coaching we do that, but being more sensitive. I'm, as you share, I'm invited to be even more sensitive and more aware of how that process is taking place in the sessions. Even in small little things, like that's a good breath. That's a great example. Thanks, Jen.
Thank you all so much for sharing all those very deeply personal tidbits and all of your brains and your cognitive views. You're all amazing human beings, and I'm very grateful to have you here and able to share and willing to share. Kind of wrapping up, we're getting close on time. I wanted to kind of ask one final question overall, which is kind of like, I guess there's no separation really in the body unless we make it, right? And I was kind of wondering more about the relationship between how the cognitive and the heart kind of interact and their emotions. And I guess since we're getting close on time, I don't really have time to deep dive. More of like probably how are we feeling cognitively and emotionally getting ready to leave this place, which would be a great way to end the episode.
So Jess, the question is kind of like a checkout, like a cognitive and emotional checkout for each of us.
Yep.
Yeah, I can go first. Cognitively, I think as I'm leaving the episode, I'm really almost sort of like reflecting and observing all that we've shared, all of the different cool topics that we've introduced and the arcs and where they took us to other topics. And cognitively, I'm feeling that I'm like an evaluative type format. I'm cognitively thinking, I think this was a good episode to bring in a lot of nuance around the impact of trauma from a cognitive perspective. And then emotionally, I'm having a very different experience. I'm not evaluating anything. I'm just sensing into and feeling connected to everybody here on this episode. I'm feeling seen. I'm feeling witnessed. I'm feeling compassion for what everyone else has shared, feeling connection. And so I guess if I were to integrate those two things, it's like I'm noticing so much observation here, so much connection here,